Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever sat down with a really dense novel for a research paper and just felt that low-level anxiety that you're somehow missing the underlying point? Well, you are definitely not alone. As an undergraduate English researcher, it's incredibly easy to fall into the trap of just taking a text at face value, basically letting the author completely steer your essay. But today, I'm stepping in as your expert tutor to help you move way beyond the basics of simple close reading. We're going to totally dismantle the illusion of textual neutrality and give you a methodical, practical toolkit. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how to uncover how textual meaning is shaped not just by what is written, but by how it's narrated, structured, and received. Okay, let's quickly map out our agenda for this explainer. We'll be covering reading gaps and silences, diagnosing narrator authority, applying ideological lenses, reading against the grain, and finally, affective reading and journaling. All right, let's dive right into Section 1, Reading Gaps and Silences. What is missing? We need to begin by shifting our focus entirely away from the explicit arguments a text builds, and instead look closely at the spaces and voices it deliberately or unconsciously excludes. When you crack open a book, the absolute first question every rigorous researcher must ask is, what is the text leaving unsaid? I mean, we naturally gravitate toward the plot and the visible characters, right? But silence in literature isn't just an empty space. It is a highly deliberate choice, or perhaps an authorial blind spot that invites some really deep critical interpretation. To read for absences means asking why certain stories are missing. Are they intentionally omitted to protect a specific worldview, or are they unsaid because the author simply couldn't even fathom their existence? Evaluating these textual gaps reveals the hidden power dynamics operating right beneath the surface. Think about Gayatri Spivak's brilliant concept of the subaltern. It reminds us that some voices aren't just left out by accident, they are structurally unheard within the dominant discourse. There's a massive difference between a casually missing voice and a structurally unheard one. So, detecting these absences involves way more than just noticing who isn't in the room. It means paying close attention to the very structure of the text itself. You want to notice those subtle gaps where a narrative suddenly grows vague, where the syntax actually fractures, or where the story entirely skips over potential perspectives. These signals point directly to underlying repressions within the narrative. And remember, we aren't doing this just to accuse the text, but to open it up, to figure out exactly what the author chose to exclude and why. Moving right along to Section 2, Diagnosing Narrator Authority. Who is speaking? Let's completely bust the myth of the neutral voice, shall we? We are going to dismantle the mechanics of the story by questioning the power dynamics of the narrator's vantage point. When you encounter a first-person narrator, that confessional warmth and intimacy they use can easily camouflage deeply embedded biases. It manipulates your empathy, making you trust them without question, and before you know it, you're adopting their blind spots as your own. On the flip side, an ostensibly objective third-person narrator can guide you just as forcefully. They employ what we call selective focalization. By zooming in on specific details while totally ignoring others, they create a hierarchy of knowledge for you, the reader, quietly dictating what you look at and what you ignore. So neither voice is neutral. Contrasting these narrators shows how they create entirely different reader biases and firmly establish whose experiences actually matter. Consider this your ultimate practical diagnostic cheat sheet for catching an unreliable narrator in the act. As an undergraduate researcher, you absolutely have to evaluate the narrator as rigorously as any other character in the book, diagnosing their reliability through tone and focalization shifts. Keep an eye out for a narrator who asserts absolute certainty but routinely hedges with speculative language. Pay really close attention if there are sudden, unexplained shifts in narrative tone. And definitely notice if lavish attention is given to one character's inner life alongside a completely cursory, brushed-over treatment of marginalized characters. These aren't just innocent stylistic choices. They are massive red flags signaling class, gender, or racial hierarchies operating just beneath the prose. And that perfectly sets up Section 3, Applying Ideological Lenses, Power, Identity, and Representation. Every single text exists within a much broader network of historical forces, and we need specific theoretical frameworks to uncover how stories participate in those powerful systems. Let's look at how utilizing these lenses transforms a standard research interpretation into a really powerful comparative inquiry. Imagine you're reading a classic 19th century novel featuring a wealthy male estate owner and a female servant. If you apply a feminist framework, you'll likely look at the woman's lack of agency to critique patriarchal structures. But if you take that exact same character hierarchy and apply a Marxist lens, the critique shifts entirely to class relations and material conditions, exposing economic inequality. You can contrast this further by bringing in queer theory, which might expose how that exact same power dynamic enforces rigid binary representations of gender and desire. Alternatively, contrasting the impact of a post-colonial lens versus queer theory on these representations shows how imperialism and cultural erasure operate differently than heteronormative conventions, yet they both serve to marginalize the other. This is exactly how you systematically compare ideological patterns across different historical and cultural literary contexts.
Now notice how texts can sneakily reinforce specific worldviews through binary hierarchies. Let's look at a specific example of identifying this ideological bias in classic literary texts. Think about a standard run-of-the-mill adventure novel from the Victorian era. The text will consistently associate heroism, rationality, and progress with masculinity or whiteness, while simultaneously mapping passivity, chaos, or emotional excess onto marginalized characters. It's doing so much more than just telling a thrilling story. It's actively reinforcing an imperial worldview. As a researcher, your job is to systematically uncover and challenge these binary structures in character representation and social roles, pointing out exactly how the text naturalizes these deeply rooted power imbalances.
Gabrielle Griffin hit the nail on the head when she stated that reading must be attentive to the ways texts either uphold or contest dominant ideologies. Discovering whose interests are served by the narrative is absolutely central to understanding how literature shapes public consciousness. Honestly, texts either uphold the status quo or they subtly question it. There's rarely an in-between. So when you sit down to write your next research paper, I really want you to ask yourself, whose interests is this author actively protecting?
Which brings us to Section 4, Reading Against the Grain, Disrupting the Path.
Look, most texts are engineered to be a super smooth, comfortable ride. They're crafted to guide you along a very specific emotional and intellectual path. But reading against the grain means intentionally hitting the brakes and lifting the hood to look at the engine. You have to question what feels natural to uncover hidden cultural assumptions and narrative ruptures. By flat-out refusing to just accept the text's surface-level coherence, you can probe the inconsistencies and marginalizations that reveal its deeper ideological work. When something in a story feels completely frictionless and unquestioned, that is exactly where you need to pause and ask yourself what is being erased or maybe oversimplified to make this reading experience feel so smooth.
And here is where Zinna O'Leary brings up a hugely important ethical point about the awareness required from you as a researcher. She notes that our interpretations are not value-free. You aren't just a brain in a jar processing words in a vacuum, right? Your background, your training, and your expectations dictate what you notice and what you overlook. Understanding how your own researcher positionality shapes your interpretation of hidden power dynamics is exactly what prevents you from simply imposing your own preconceived meaning onto the text.
Finally, let's dive into Section 5, Effective Reading and Journaling. Emotion as Data.
This is where we explore how to apply affective reading to uncover hidden textual biases. Now, traditional practice might tell you to sideline your feelings in favor of pure, detached objectivity. But affective reading proves that emotion is fundamentally tied to how a text persuades and mobilizes ideology. Every sigh, shiver, or moment of discomfort you feel while reading is a vital interpretive opening. Why? Because our bodies often react to the mobilization of ideology long before our intellectual brains process it. That physical discomfort shows you exactly how the text is manipulating mood and sensation to make its ideological point.
We can actually look to John Creswell's reflexivity methods here, which tell us to take note of how narrative form, rhythm, or imagery generate feeling. We really must treat our moments of unease, of empathy, as vital data points, connected directly to the text structure. For example, if you're reading a passage and a sudden shift in focalization makes you feel strangely defensive or anxious, treating that unease as data means pausing, documenting that reaction, and tracing it all the way back to the exact sentence structure that triggered it in the first place.
So, let's put this into practice with a quick step-by-step workshop plan for reflexive journaling. This is going to help you perfectly balance personal engagement with rigorous academic critique. Instead of just listing these steps, imagine this scenario. You're reading a passage that makes you unexpectedly angry. Stop. Notice that emotion. Next, record your bodily reaction. Maybe your jaw is clenched. Don't rush to analyze it yet. Just write it down. Then, hunt for the exact textual trigger. Was it a specific metaphor or a dismissive tone shift by the narrator? Once you find it, trace that trigger to the larger themes of the book. And finally, use O'Leary's methods to reflect on why that specific portrayal stirred you, surfacing your own unconscious biases. This is exactly how you transform a fleeting feeling into transparent, highly rigorous research data.
As you apply all these lenses, whether you're hunting for gaps, diagnosing a narrator's reliability, or tracing your own emotional shivers back to a text, remember that your ultimate tool is your own critically engaged perspective. So the final provocative question I want to leave you with today is this. As you go back to your research, are you just reading the text, or are you finally ready to analyze how the text is reading you? Thanks for joining me in this explainer, and happy researching.